I am getting started making my mug, and the first thing I'm going to do, just like the first thing I always do, is wedge the clay. Now you notice I'm showing you the technique here. I'm standing up, I'm using the palms of my hands and leaning into the clay, and then I'll peel it up using my fingers. I go 3 or 4 times from one direction, and then I pick it up and twist it and wedge it from the other direction, and you just repeatedly do this. And you might do this depending on the size of clay that you're wedging. You might do it 25 to 30, 35 times, somewhere in there. Remember, the whole point of this is to get rid of all the air bubbles that might be in the clay and to even it out if there are some softer or drier spots. We want to get all the clay nice and even and get all the air bubbles out. Now I get this into kind of a rectangular prism, like a cube form, and I'm starting to throw a slab. Now I'm just dropping it onto the table. I'm letting gravity be the downward force, and then as I drop it, I pull my arms back, right? So I'm pulling it back and just letting the downward force of gravity be what stretches the clay out. Now if I want to change the if I want to make it more square, I can throw it from the other angle. If I want to make it longer, I can keep hitting the sides in like I just did there, and that will ensure that I have more of a rectangle slab. I'm going to show you how to use the slab rolling machine here. And this is really useful if you want a big slab. So you've got to make sure that it's low enough to fit through those rollers. So you're going to have to throw the slab like I was just doing to start with. And then once it gets down to about the size that I showed you, you can start pulling it through. And it's pretty simple. You just put it in between those two canvas sheets and roll that wheel and just lightly pull on the canvas as it's going through, and you go all the way through one side, and then I will pull it back the other way. And you do want to make sure that you're not getting the cloth tangled up in the wheel. So you see I keep messing with it and throwing it out of the way. And that's something to be conscious of because that can cause you some problems. And you can see how long it is. And this is really hard to do by hand. So this slab rolling machine is really good for that. When I pick it up, you want to make sure that you're supporting the whole slab. And so I lay it on my arm so that it doesn't stretch out too much. Now from this slab, I'm going to cut out my circular base and my rectangle that I'm going to use to build the walls of the cylinder. So I'm looking at my slab and I'm seeing where it makes sense to cut it out. And I see that it's much bigger on the one end, and so I won't be able to use that end for a rectangle necessarily. So I'll cut my circle out of that, and I'm just using a cup to cut it out. And you can use anything that you find around the room. It could be the bottom of a glaze bottle, a cup like I'm using, any other jar or circular thing that you want to trace that you think fits the size of the mug that you want to make. So there you go, I got a base. Now I need to cut a rectangle out for the walls of my cylinder. I'm going to trim up the edges here. And now I'm going to get a rough estimate of how long my rectangle needs to be. So I just put a little notch in my circle, and then I'm going to roll it along the slab. And when the notch gets back, that's roughly the length of my rectangle. And I'll need to trim it up again, but at least this way I get kind of a starting point. And it's always better to have it a little longer and trim it down than too short. You have a lot more problems that way. And so I'm just trimming these edges and getting it to be a nice rectangle here. Now I'm going to hold it up to the circle and get a little bit more of an accurate measurement of exactly where I need to trim my rectangle. I set it on there. I wrap it around. It's too long and it's going to overlap. And so I just take my knife, my clay knife, and I make a little line where that overlap seam is, and then I'm going to trim it from there. Now at this point, I have my two pieces of clay that I'm going to connect. And so whenever you're connecting clay, you always need to slip and score all the edges that are going to be coming into contact. So the top of the circle, the bottom of the rectangle, the sides are all going to be slip and scored. So I'm using this metal rib tool with the teeth on the ends of it, and I'm roughing up the surface. I'm making the texture, and that serves the purpose of being kind of like Velcro that interlocks with each other and will really help it stick together. And just like I scored that, I'm going through and scoring the rest of the sides that are going to be coming into contact. I'm going to add some slip and connect these two pieces, but before I do that, I want to work on some sort of a base so that I don't have to keep handling my work, because if I keep handling it, it'll start to get lopsided and dented. So I put the base up on this turntable, or this Lazy Susan is another thing that it's called, and I'm going to start adding some slip to it. And so I just paint around all of the areas that I scored, and then I will attach it. Now I'm pushing the two pieces together, adding pressure, and then I will eventually smooth out the seam. So you got a couple S's to remember. You slip, score, and smooth. And another technique that you can do to help to make sure that the two pieces are fully connected is you can call it stitching. It's going back and forth across the seam. And here you see that I'm using a wooden tool to help me move the clay back and forth across the seam and then blend it together. And that's the goal right now, is blending this seam together. I'm going to show you another technique now called a coil technique. So we've went over the slab. That's how we've gotten the cylinder so far. For a coil, I start in kind of an egg shape or an oval shape, and then I'm rolling it back and forth. So a couple things to think about is I'm going all the way through the rotation over 360 degrees to make sure that it's not going back and forth and making like a rectangle. And then the other thing is that I'm spreading my pressure out. I'm using the flat part of my fingers, and I'm fanning them out so that I have pressure on the whole roll and not just one part. And I'm just gonna keep going until it gets to the size that I want it to be. I'm trimming the edges off too, uh, because a lot of times they kind of fold over each other. Now, uh, if the coil starts uh, getting edge on it, or if it starts being rectangular, you can just pat it down to keep that cylinder kind of form. Now here I trimmed it down to the size that I want my handle to be, and then I'm just going to slip and score all the pieces that are going to be attached. I slip and score everything that attaches, so of course I do the handle as well. And then I connect it using the same uh, technique that I connected the walls of the cylinder. I slip, score, and then I kind of smooth out the edges. I'm using that wooden tool again to make sure that I have pressure on the inside of the cylinder so that I don't dent my cylinder when I'm pushing against the outside wall. And that's something that you'll probably want to do depending on if you can reach inside or not. And I could have made this process of connecting the handle much easier on myself if I would have cut the handle at an angle instead of straight. I would have had more surface area to connect. Now the last two techniques that I'm going to show you are two hand molding techniques, is what I call them. So I'm just going to make a nose out of these two different techniques. So the first one is just starting with a lump of clay, basically of wedged clay. You might cut it off and a corner of your slab or something like that. But so I'm just going to take a lump of clay and start pushing it around, moving it around with my fingers, and you can get pretty much any form, if it's small enough. That's the thing. This works really well for features or for additions or whatever that are small enough to just to mold with your fingers. Now remember, I want all of my mug to be uniform thickness, to be the same thickness. So this nose is going to be really thick. So I'm going to want to trim it down a little bit, and I will do that by hollowing out the back. I'll use some sort of scooper tool or a knife, and you can see here I trim it, and then I'm carving away at it a little bit, and that way there'll be a negative space or there'll be a hollow space. When I attach this to the mug, there will be a potential problem. There's going to be a negative space that's full of air when I push that up against the side of the mug. And we know that we can't have that. We can't have that pocket of air because it's going to want to expand and that would explode in the kiln. And so here I'm showing you what it would look like to be attached. And you have a couple solutions. You need some vents. You need an area where the air can escape. So you could have the nostrils open, or you could just cut a small vent. It doesn't need to be big either. It just needs to be a hole so that the air can escape that cavity. Now the second technique that I'm going to use is just to cut it right out of a slab. So instead of starting with a chunk of clay, I'm going to cut kind of a nose shape out of the slab and then pick that up and mold a nose using that. And so I'll push on the back to kind of form the ball of the nose. I'll curve the nostrils around, and it's pretty much the same thing. I'm just starting with a lot less clay so that I don't necessarily have to carve as much of away as I did with the first technique. The end result will be pretty much the same. It's a little bit of preference. It's whichever one you want to do, whichever one you think works better for the particular feature that you're trying to create, that you're trying to sculpt or mold. And, depending on what it is, one might work better than the other. But they're basically the same thing. And that's going to be, for this project, at least for the sculpted mug project, a lot of the details that you're going to be added are going to be using these hand molding techniques. And that should be everything that you need to complete this project. You have your slabs, coils, and hand molding. So have fun.